Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Everyday Writers, your one-stop shop for demystifying the writing process and helpful guides on your journey to becoming a published writer. I'm one of your hosts, Crystal McQueen.
And I'm your other host, Jordan S. Keller. Thank you so much for joining us on our very first episode of Everyday Writers. Today we're going to focus on how to start that novel you've always talked about writing, which can be a very intimidating prospect.
In this episode, Jordan and I are going to talk about some of our own processes to getting that novel started. And as you will learn throughout our journey together, just like many authors, Jordan and I don't always have the same approach. For example, I primarily write speculative fiction, literary fiction, and I am definitely a plotter.
While on the other hand, as the author of the Ashes Over Avalon trilogy that dabbles in romance, I'll talk more about how I took an idea and pantsed my way through to a full trilogy. So Crystal, starting writing, what got you into the hobby, what got you into the craft, and what made you put that pen to page for the very first time?
So for me, I have always loved stories. I've been a big reader ever since I was little. In fifth grade, I read a book called The Stepsister by R.L. Stine, and I converted that book into a play. And then I got all of my classmates out on the playground and gave them copies of the play, and we acted out The Stepsister. And then, in eighth grade, I wrote a novel about a time traveling eighth grader that went to the future and saved the world. And of course, her main love interest was whoever I was crushing on at the time. So for me, writing's just always been in the background, but it's never been at the forefront. It's always been something that I think about, that I want to do. And then that infamous pandemic happened.
I've heard of that.
And we all had so much extra time on our hands. And so I decided I was going to write that great American novel that everybody always talks about. And I wrote it, and I hated it. And so I ended up enrolling in an MFA program at EKU's Bluegrass Writer Studio. From there, I have since written 12 short pieces, received 200 rejections for those pieces, and have published 5 of them. So how about you, Jordan? How'd you get started?
Yeah, so I've always loved stories. My parents would always tell me stories. We would always sit around a campfire and share them. And in second grade, we had a homework assignment where we had to write a one-page fable. And I turned in 4 pages, and I've had the bug ever since. In middle and high school, I wrote very Twilight-like romance stories, which also featured my current crush at the time. I hope he never sees them. And then in college, I started writing scenes from our D&D campaign, and that was a great exercise in taking things you see mentally and then putting them down on paper. One of those Dungeons and Dragons characters I had plopped into a superhero setting, and that became sort of the ground zero for Ashes Over Avalon. It took 83 rejections after I finished that manuscript and 3 rewrites, but finally book 3 is coming to a shelf near you this fall.
That's amazing. I've read the first 2 books, and I cannot wait for the third.
Thank you.
And so, Jordan, that is so impressive. And I think you've mentored quite a few writers in your time, through the writing group that you run. And so what's a piece of advice that you always give to first-time writers?
Yeah, so the advice, it's super simple. Your first draft doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be finished. The goal is to get your story on the page, and it's going to be messy. Enjoy the first 8 feelings of getting to know your story, your world, and characters without putting any pressure on yourself or that first draft. I always start with a trash draft. It's me giving myself permission to let this draft be as awful as possible, just so long as I get the story down. I'm an underwriter, so my first drafts are always low word counts, and they're just the bare bones. I'll expand and explore the characters that I've fallen in love with in the later drafts. As an example, most science fiction novels written by debut authors are about 80,000 words. After I finished my first draft, Wildfire, Book 1 of Ashes Over Avalon was only 28,000 words, and the final manuscript that was published is at 83,000.
In contrast, I overwrite every single scene I write. In which if I left it that way, I would bore readers to tears. The first draft of the novel that I wrote during the pandemic, it ended at 140,000 words, which is a lot of words. But by writing these elaborate scenes in detail, it helps me visualize my characters' motivations and all those external forces that can have an impact on their actions and decisions. So for me, unfortunately, for every 500 words I write, I probably keep 50. I know it's really difficult, and it seems like there's a ton of different ways that you can start a novel, but like you start a novel one way and I started a novel a different way. And just, I think the biggest thing for anybody who's trying to start writing is just to put words on the page. You know, whether you're a plotter like me or a pantser like you can edit later, but you just need those words on the page.
There's a quote I saw on Pinterest, and it's, you can't edit a blank page. And I think that's so important.
Oh, I
Just
love
get
that.
those words down.
So speaking of a blank page, because that's a great point, one of my big phobias is that blank white page. So how do you decide what you're going to write? Like, where do you get your
Yeah,
ideas?
so I'm always writing whatever I'm attracted to in the moment, whether that be a song I have on repeat, locations that I'm obsessed with, like our home city of Cincinnati, go Red Legs, or tropes I'm currently reading in other books, such as Enemies to Lovers or Rags to Riches. Those are two of my favorites. I find things that I want, and I'll just expand the idea until they'll fit into a novel. What about you? Where do you get your ideas from?
Daydreaming, inspiration from the books I'm reading, a lot of news articles. So, my most recent short story came from an article on the statistical likelihood of alien life. And, as I have to read tons of different technologies that are emerging in the marketplace for my job, that's where my stories come from. I really draw from real life. Nearly all of my stories involve some kind of technology component or absence of technology that you're used to and dependent on. And so for me, one of the most important things is when I have an idea, I have to write it down in the moment. I keep a log of every idea that I have in a note section on my phone because when I actually sit down in front of a blank page, I can't remember back to what I had inspiration for. So I need to be able to find those ideas again.
I'm in that same way, but I have to do it analog. I've got a notebook in my purse full of just rambling madwoman ideas. So once you get your ideas, how do you go about writing that novel, writing those first pages?
I'm definitely a plotter. I have to outline my story. I start with just a basic outline of the beginning and the end of the story, and then I put bullet points in between of different ideas of ways that I can get from point A to point B. And then I write the first 1 to 2 chapters, and then I write the last chapter. I'll try to write at least 2 or 3 of the last chapters, but I have to have that last chapter. And then as I'm writing, I know where I'm headed. So even though when I finally do get to the end of that first draft, it never looks like my outline, it kept me focused so I don't write about topics that are different or even end up in a totally different story. So that's how I approach it, but I know you have a much different approach.
Yes, so I am a pantser, meaning I fly by the seat of my pants. I don't believe in outlines. If I'm lucky, I'll have a couple bullet point to-do lists of scenes I want to include in the novel. But basically, I'm letting my characters write their own story, letting them explore the world, get into antics, and kind of get to where I think they're going to go. But I'm just as surprised as everyone when we reach that ending. And when I get to my second and third drafts, I'm writing to make it look purposeful, that I knew what was going along the whole time.
And see, that's amazing. I think that that's so impressive that people can do that, that you can do that. I've seen your end story. So I know that eventually it does end up to be a purposeful story. But for me, a lot of the way I write came from trial and error. So I had to learn that if I don't have an outline, I get distracted. How about you? Like, do you have trial and error examples?
Yeah, I did try an outline for one of my novels, and it was an extensive, like 30-page outline, and I knew how the story ended, so what was the point in writing it? And that's when I realized, like, I have to go in blind, so I'm eager to figure it out and keep writing it every day.
Well, okay, that's another thing I'm interested in. So, how do you approach writing? Like, how do you approach actually going from the first date feel of having an idea and putting it on paper and finding, like, finishing it to the end?
Yeah, so kind of contrary to what I said, I know where I think it should end, so I'm always writing with an end in mind. And then I always give myself very obtainable goals. So right now it's 200 words a day, just something basic and simple to make sure I stay on top of things. What about you?
For me, it's a little bit different. And as you know, with this current NaNoWriMo, I can't give myself a daily word goal. That's just too much pressure on myself. I try to continue to develop scenes in my head, keeping notes in my phone, so that when I sit down to actually write, that I'm not trying to come up with a scene or do all of that mental work. So I'll spend several days, or even weeks thinking about a scene, thinking about what I want the scene to say before I actually sit down and put it on paper. But I mean, that just shows that you can have very different ways of approaching writing and still end up with a beautiful product at the end that people enjoy reading.
Yeah, and there's no wrong way to write, and there's no wrong way to develop your craft. So long as you're passionate about it, you're gonna succeed.
It actually is a pet peeve of mine when somebody says something like, you have to put words on the page every day, or you have to do it this way, or you have to write first thing in the morning. And it doesn't allow people to be who they are. You and your writer self are in this together, and you need to be kind to who you are. So if you're not a morning person, you don't need to get up and force yourself to write and then beat yourself up for not doing it. You need to find out what works for you. This has been a wonderful conversation, Jordan. Like, I've just loved this. I'm excited to continue this journey on where we're going with how we became where we are as writers, and sharing those resources that have helped us become more comfortable with our writing process.
Absolutely. Writing can be so lonely, but being a writer shouldn't be. So I'm really glad we're taking the plunge and we're getting out there and we're sharing all these tips and tricks we've learned, that you've learned through MFA, sharing with us at our writing group and giving it to other writers.
Well, and that you've learned and expressed through multiple writing groups because you're super fancy.
Exactly. And in later episodes, we'll explore some more resources to help you develop and become more comfortable with your writing approach. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of finally putting your pen to the page through Everyday Writers. Thank you so much for letting us be a part of your journey to becoming a published writer.
And just remember, a first draft doesn't have to be perfect.
When you have an idea, don't lose it. Write it down.
And whether you're a plotter or a pantser, write with your end in mind. Join us for our next episode, Write Your Way, where we will talk about silencing that inner critic, finding time to write, and much, much more.
And if you have any questions or comments, please join our Facebook community at the Everyday Writers. We'd love to hear from you. Until then, see you next time. And don't forget, every day is a good day to write.